Over the next 2 years, Eli Drinkwitz has a chance to rank as high as anybody in the SEC other than Kirby Smart.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And with a lot of hoops coming up this week, I'm going to make this a mostly football-eccentric show, especially to start the show. And I got to say, I thought the odds, my first reaction, just for example, Missouri against Ole Miss, a little bit out of whack. Are the Tigers being disrespected once again? And I have to say, though, the modern culture in sports often focuses on disrespect. I think that's missing the point a little bit very often. I do want to remind you today's episode is brought to you by the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Stay with us for the Armada Team of the Week later in the episode. And let's start off here by, again, talking about Eli Drinkwitz. Where does he rank in the SEC? Where can he rank here in just a short period of time? Well, first of all, where does he rank right now? Where can I, as the biased Missouri fan that I am, how high can I truly push Eli Drinkwitz up the list? Well, as I already alluded to, going to be impossible to put Drinkwitz or anybody in the SEC, for that matter, ahead of Georgia's Kirby Smart. Frankly, he's the only person who's won a national championship in this group, so how can I possibly put anybody else ahead of him? And not only has Georgia won once, well, they've won twice and been as good of a program as anybody in the 2020s, in the post-COVID era, without a doubt. So he's far and above everyone else. But then when you get to number 2, heck, I could argue for a lot of people for second in the league. I'm just not so sure that I can argue for Eli Drinkwitz, because when it comes to Kalen DeBoer at Alabama, Steve Sarkisian at Texas, Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss, and Josh Heupel at Tennessee, I just think a little bit more has been accomplished by those few guys than Eli Drinkwitz. And yes, I'd throw Brian Kelly at LSU in there as well. Even though, by the way, DeBoer at Alabama, like Kelly at LSU, well, they really haven't done it in their SEC schools yet. In fact, I'd argue Eli Drinkwitz's tenure in the SEC, if we're just looking at SEC only, has been more impressive than either one of those guys so far. But I still have to give DeBoer, of course, a lot of credit for making the college football playoff, the national championship game with Washington just a couple years ago. And obviously Josh Heupel has made a college football playoff, has had more big seasons at this point than Eli Drinkwitz. Steve Sarkisian has Texas off and running, of course, as well. No real explanation needed there. And I think Brian Kelly, for all the, well, I'm not the biggest Brian Kelly fan, I have to admit, but I think what he's done at Notre Dame, you have to at least respect that. He's made a national championship and a national runner-up at the very least at Notre Dame. But all of those guys, to me, you can pick nits, and I just did with a bunch of them, and none of them have been to the top of the mountain other than Kirby Smart just yet. So to me, if you're Eli Drinkwitz, I think you're 7th at worst. So you're in the top half of this league, and really everybody from 2 to say even 8 at the very least. Shane Beamer, go down to Mike Elko, Texas A&M. Some guy, Brent Venables, still has time to turn it around at Oklahoma. There's still a bunch of guys who you could see jumping up into that top half or even into that second spot. But to me, Eli Drinkwitz has a real shot at this, especially based on what Missouri does the next couple seasons. I think especially in 2026, Missouri's going to have a real big opportunity to have another huge season. But if Missouri can pull it together in 2025 and have anything close to another 10-win season, you can talk me into Drinkwitz being second at this point, because this is the season where you would think Missouri would take a step back, where Missouri is going to have a bit of a transition. Even though, yes, we're in the portal era, Missouri has a great portal class by all accounts, and yet still, inexperience at the quarterback position, receiver, offensive line, it's hard to just go overboard for Missouri at this particular moment. So if they're able to exceed expectations, go ahead and just start drawing up another Eli Drinkwitz contract extension. Now, speaking of 10-win seasons, of course, one thing that has happened over the decades is that the value of a 10-win football season in college football has obviously been watered down. It's not what it used to be with, of course, the expansion of schedules going from 10 to 11 to 12, and, of course, beyond now with the playoff in many teams' cases. And, of course, the watering down of non-conference schedules as well, especially, my goodness, in Missouri's case, when you go back to the 70s and 80s, the gauntlets that Missouri would play in the non-conference schedules was absolutely insane. It would have exploded Gary Pinkel's head. There is no question about that. But the point is, I think with the strengthening of at least the SEC and the Big Ten, especially the SEC for our purposes, I do think that the 10-win season is actually going up in value, and with the increase, I think, in parity that you're going to see in the SEC over the coming years, I just think a 10-win season suddenly, back in the day, hey, I hate to say it, in the Big 12 North, a 10-win season wasn't quite what it meant in the SEC West, for example. Well, now in this day and age, unfortunately, it's much more about how did your schedule fall in the SEC versus, well, which division you're in versus everybody else in college football. And that's sort of the unfortunate part. I should say one of the unfortunate parts, I think, of a 16-team football league is that what was supposed to be a leveling of the playing field. Of course, in the old Big 8, you played 7 games, and everybody played the exact same schedule. Of course, you'd flip home and away every year. But now in the SEC, at least at this moment, yeah, Missouri's playing the same schedule they played last year, flipping it home and away, but that schedule has absolutely nothing in common, for example, with what the Oklahoma Sooners are going to face this season. I'm kind of bullish on Oklahoma this season with their new quarterback, John Mateer, and offensive coordinator following with him, both from Washington State. Plus, the Sooners just had terrible injury luck last year, but then I look at Oklahoma's schedule, and I think, I don't really love any of their games as far as, hey, let's just chalk that up as a definite victory in the SEC. Their easiest games are probably Auburn at home and Missouri at home. Guess who beat them last year? Yes, the Missouri Tigers, number 1. So I wouldn't exactly call any of those games a layup whatsoever. Plus, Oklahoma has Michigan at home as a non-conference foe at Temple, and what may be a tricky game at Lincoln Financial Field in Philadelphia. Who knows? But the point here is that I would be much more bullish on Oklahoma if it weren't for their absolutely brutal schedule, which, again, Missouri's schedule, not easy by any stretch of the imagination, but compared to Oklahoma and Florida's, there really is no comparison. And while that's possibly advantageous for Missouri this coming season and maybe last season as well, it's going to hit Missouri one of these years, so we'll see what happens. But first, it is time for the Armada Team of the Week, brought to you by our friends at Nissan and the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Each week, our Locked On college basketball experts are picking one team that stands apart. And this week's Armada clear-cut Team of the Week is the Duke Blue Devils. John Shire's team, led by National Player of the Year candidate Cooper Flagg, just ripped through the ACC, going 19-1. The Blue Devils were plus 434 points in ACC games, the largest differential by a Power 5 conference team in league play since Kentucky in 1953-54. When it comes to the Nissan Armada, they say go forth and conquer, and that's exactly what Duke has done here. It's clear that our team of the week is out here ready to conquer the road with confidence, just like you can in the all-new Nissan Armada or any of Nissan's outstanding vehicles. Take the Nissan Armada, Rogue, or Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. So again, just to recap, I was initially a little bit confused as to why Ole Miss, the Rebels, would have so much more favorable odds to win the SEC, for example, this season than Missouri does. When you consider, hey, similar records last season, breaking in new quarterbacks, that type of thing. So what is the deal there? So I decided to take a little bit more of a deep dive, figure out what exactly I was missing, if anything. And if you look at, well, the all-important transfer portal rankings during the offseason, and I say all-important, not necessarily the rankings themselves, but obviously the amount of production that you get in the portal that for this coming season is going to have a huge impact on your season. Our ability to, well, predict that, we can argue. But the point is, in the portal rankings, according to a couple sources, Missouri 6th in the country, according to 24/7 this past cycle. Ole Miss 2nd. So Ole Miss a little higher, but obviously Missouri with an elite portal class in the entire country. And by the way, On3 agrees. They also have Ole Miss 2nd in the country, but even Missouri a little bit higher with the 4th best portal country in all of college football in this past cycle. So really, is it really about this upcoming season? Again, with not much more experience with Austin Simmons. Sure, Simmons with Ole Miss last year, but Prabula with, I would say, similar, if not a little bit more experience last season with Penn State. Again, a different program, but still a similar level of college football, obviously. Well, you had to look more really at last season, I think, and Missouri's 10-3 versus Ole Miss's 10-3, which, to be fair, were not created equally because, my goodness, when you look back at it, of course, Missouri had a couple of blowout losses. Texas A&M and Alabama pretty well handled Missouri. Now, a heartbreaking loss in Columbia, South Carolina to a very good Gamecocks team. Nothing to really hang your head about there, but obviously Missouri, no real excuses in those two other road games. Ole Miss, on the other hand, my goodness, you go back and you look at their results, and I have to say I get a little focused sometimes on just Missouri and with this podcast, hey, what's coming up next, that you lose a little bit of context with the rest of the country occasionally. And I remember how bad the Florida game was for the Rebels and how heartbreaking that was for Jackson Dart, the Ole Miss quarterback, and his team. But my goodness, when you go back and you look at the stats, this is one of the biggest bag fumbles of all time by Ole Miss. You look at the S&P Plus projections, the advanced stats, Mizzou's Bill Conley, the main man over at ESPN, handling those numbers. Would you believe that Ole Miss was the second best team in the country behind Ohio State last year? Now, we can quibble with those numbers, of course, but second best, and they didn't even make the 12-team playoff? My goodness. Losing a 3-point game, week 5 to Kentucky, of course, pretty bizarrely, by the way, losing a 3-point game in overtime in Tiger Stadium to LSU. Again, nothing to really hang your head about there, but really the totally inexplicable loss at Florida late in the season. Just one of the bigger heartbreaks I've ever seen in the history of college football. It was really brutal to watch. But the point here is that really Ole Miss's 10-3 season, it simply was a lot better than Missouri's 10-3 season last year. I'll definitely give the Rebels that. But I don't know how much that matters for 2025. And if his On3 says it's the second best transfer portal class against the fourth, and again, if we're talking Austin Simmons against Bo Prabula, can any of us confidently say which one of those two is going to be the better player right now? I'll confess to having not done a deep dive on Austin Simmons, but I've watched as much Beau Pribula as I possibly can, and there's a heck of a lot of promise there. So while I do think, hey, if you're FanDuel and you want to give Ole Miss better odds than Missouri next season, by the way, Ole Miss, a relatively favorable SEC schedule themselves, I don't blame you. I don't blame FanDuel for giving Ole Miss better odds. But Missouri, 50-1 versus 10-1, that doesn't quite add up to me. It really doesn't. So, I don't know. Is Missouri being disrespected once again? I don't know about disrespected, but underestimated? Yes, I would say that they are, at least at the moment. And by the way, speaking of disrespect, let's talk just a little bit of basketball here for a minute. And I do think some Missouri fans a few weeks ago were missing the point a little bit when they were focusing on, well, the amount of disrespect that they felt Missouri got in the postseason, or in the preseason, I should say. Missouri picked to finish, say, 12th or 13th in the league, that type of deal. Well, obviously those calls have quieted down here a little bit as Missouri has just won one of its last 5 games here. But I think a lot of times in this sports culture, so many athletes kind of miss the point. I mean, Missouri was 0-19 last year, guys. Where were they supposed to be expected to finish? Again, Dennis Gates, his staff deserve a tremendous amount of credit for turning it around this season, but to act like the college football and SEC landscape at large should have seen it coming, I just think you're almost stealing joy from yourself a little bit. Now, don't get me wrong, if in that locker room, if the shush move, if that plays well and has helped them win games, God bless them. I just think at a certain point, you are stealing joy from yourself a little bit. I'm just growing a little bit tired of the proving the doubters wrong culture when, I don't know, it still seems like to me that the star athletes of the world are treated pretty well. I get it. It seems like most people treat them as the stars that they pretty much are. I understand that social media gets ugly. Believe me, as a semi-public figure myself, I get some not-so-great comments that don't feel the best at times. You know the best solution to that? Ignore them. Log off the internet. Put the phone on silent mode. All that kind of good stuff. That would be my advice to the modern athlete who seems to think that they're just disrespected and underestimated at every turn. How can it be possible that every single athlete is being underestimated simultaneously? Not sure how the math quite works out on that one. And of course, this past summer marked the return of the college football video game, College Football 25, formerly NCAA football. Well, how about college basketball? Is there a chance that franchise could make its way back to consoles? I've got my take. I'm going to tell you here in just a little bit. But first, Mizzou fans, you ever wished you could directly support your favorite Tiger athletes and be part of their journey? Well, now you can with Roy, the NIL app that puts fans in control. Before Roy, NIL deals were often handled behind closed doors, and fans like you didn't have any way to clearly and directly support your players. Well, now with Roy, you can make a real impact and feel closer to the athletes representing Mizzou. And with Roy, you get to choose the player you want to support, decide how much you want to contribute, and get exclusive content straight from the athletes you back. And here's the best part. If your player transfers, you get your money back. So it's a risk-free way to show your support and make your voice heard. Download the Roy app now from the App Store and start backing Mizzou athletes the way they deserve, with transparency, trust, and real impact. This is the future of college sports. Join it now by downloading Roy and supporting your favorite players. And with the absolutely massive success of College Football 25 this past year, by the way, that game was the second highest selling game in all of the country behind only Call of Duty's latest entry, by the way, Black Ops 6. If you know anything about video games whatsoever, you know how massive that franchise is. So for college football, which came out, by the way, in July, so it didn't even have an entire year to sell as many games as maybe others did in longer cycles. Yeah, pretty safe to say that was a massive success for EA Sports, and that's going to be an annual release from here on out. But I do think this gives an opportunity for NCAA basketball to come back. I think there's going to be a college basketball game coming back. I really do, because even though obviously it's not going to sell like that game did, I'm guessing EA Sports didn't expect the level of success that college football game had. That had to be on the very, very upper echelon of what they expected to happen there, especially obviously with a decade plus of that game not coming out. Just a lot of pent-up demand here. Well, I think the same thing for college basketball. I really do. Obviously, again, college basketball not as big as college football, so keep your expectations reasonable for sure. But in this market, I'm telling you, it might not just be EA Sports. It might be 2K, who makes the NBA franchise and has had those exclusive rights for many years now. I could very easily see 2K coming in and making that game as well. Honestly, it'd probably be an easier putt for them since they already have a bunch of code written for the NBA game. You can take a lot of that and just make it into a college basketball game, for example. Heck, you've already seen that within the 2K games. You essentially already have a WNBA game within the NBA 2K basketball game. You can play with Sophie Cunningham and Caitlin Clark now, for example, on the Indiana Fever. So I think this is kind of an easy one, especially if 2K gets the rights. It should be a relatively low-cost risk for them. And I think the thing with basketball is it wouldn't have to be an every year release either. It could be much more like EA Sports golf game right now and the 2K golf games, which aren't annual. They come out every 2, 3, 4 years whenever they need to come out, whenever they need an upgrade, whatever it might be. It doesn't necessarily need that annual pressure, because if you play it smart, well, you can still have the game be fresh and new every year with online roster updates, all that kind of stuff. So I just think you make a good game and people will come. I think if you get the atmosphere right in college basketball, the arenas, everything like that, just like they did in college football, I think there's a real opportunity for one of those two companies, maybe even somebody else, another player who hasn't entered the fray here, to make a ton of money. But obviously 2K and EA Sports got to be your biggest competitors here. My prediction is one of them is going to take the plunge, and we'll have a college basketball video game in the next, say, 2 or 3 years or so. But hey, speaking of college basketball, listen to Locked On College Basketball with Isaac Shade and Andy Patton. March is here, so be the most informed college basketball fan right now. Find Locked On College Basketball on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So until next time, I am John Miller. Thanks for listening to Locked On Mizzou.